8:30, July 10, 1942. The morning fog over Akutan Island clung low to the ground, rolling in slow gray sheets across the tundra as a small recovery team stepped off their boat, boots sinking into the wet earth. The air smelled of cold seawater and volcanic soil. Somewhere ahead, hidden in the grass and mist, lay the impossible, a nearly intact Japanese Zero fighter, something no American pilot had ever examined up close. The men moved carefully, their breath visible in the frigid Alaskan air. A steady wind whispered through long-soaked grass, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of burned oil. Seagulls cried overhead. Every sound felt amplified in the silence of the island. Their hands were cold, numb even through gloves, but adrenaline pushed them forward. What they were about to find would change the course of the air war in the Pacific. One of the sailors spotted it first, a glint of sunlight bouncing off metal. They froze. The silhouette slowly formed through the fog. Low wings, narrow fuselage, the unmistakable profile that so many American pilots had seen only in combat, seconds before being shot down. A Mitsubishi A6M-0. The fighter that had dominated the sky since Pearl Harbor, the machine that seemed unstoppable. But this one hadn't burned. It hadn't exploded. It hadn't been torn apart. It had skidded into this lonely patch of land, nose down, propeller bent, but otherwise nearly perfect, as if it had been placed there deliberately, waiting to be studied. The men approached with a mixture of fear and awe. No one had ever stood this close to a Zero that wasn't trying to kill them. For months, American pilots had been desperate to understand how this aircraft could turn so tightly, climb so fast, and strike with such precision. Rumors spread in ready rooms, some accurate, many exaggerated. But now, for the first time, the truth sat right in front of them. And somewhere inside this machine, answers waited. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles south, pilots of the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps were locked in brutal dogfights over the Pacific. Reports from those men painted the same story again and again. The Zero dominated the opening seconds of combat. It climbed like nothing they'd ever seen. It turned so sharply that American fighters seemed sluggish and unresponsive in comparison. And it struck with deadly accuracy. But pilots also mentioned something else, something stranger and less understood. If they pushed their dive fast enough, if they forced a high-speed escape, something about the Zero changed. Its movement stiffened. Its pilot couldn't follow as easily. The Zero's lethal agility began to fade. But why? What was happening to the controls at high speed? No one knew. The only way to find out was to examine a real Zero. Back on Akutan Island, the recovery team circled the wreckage. They already knew the story behind it. On June 4, 1942, just one day before the Battle of Midway began, a Japanese carrier division operating near the Aleutians launched several Zero pilots to escort bombers attacking Dutch Harbor. One of them, Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, had taken damage from ground fire and attempted to nurse his fighter back. He never made it. Believing Akutan's bog meant soft ground, he tried a wheels-down landing. The aircraft flipped. Koga was killed instantly, but the Zero remained largely intact. Now, after more than a month of isolation, storms, and untouched wilderness, it stood before the Americans like a rare artifact, a key to understanding the enemy, a key the U.S. desperately needed. As the men inspected the wreckage, their eyes kept returning to the ailerons, the same control surfaces American pilots had complained about when fighting the Zero in high-speed dives. Here they were, undamaged, light, simple, almost delicate. Hands ran over them, feeling the fabric covering and the thin metal supports beneath. How could something so light become nearly immovable above certain speeds? That question lingered in the cold air. Nearby, a generator hummed to life as they prepared to document every part of the fighter. The whir of cameras, the clicking of mechanical shutters, and the clatter of tools broke the silence. They recorded serial numbers, measured wing angles, mapped out the control linkages. The more they looked, the more surprises they found. The Zero was a paradox, strong enough to fight, yet fragile in its construction, advanced in design, yet built with surprisingly simple components. It wasn't armored, it lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, its structure relied on lightweight materials that saved weight but couldn't take much punishment. Every detail whispered the same truth. This aircraft was built for offense, not survival. But the biggest mystery still waited. Back at air stations across the Pacific, American pilots continued reporting strange experiences. The Zero would tear through the sky in tight spirals at low speeds, dancing around Wildcats and P-40s with elegance and precision. But once the fight accelerated, once speeds rose above 200 knots, its famous agility began to disappear. Pilots described the ailerons as heavy, locked, or almost frozen. The term frozen controls became common in debriefings. But the phenomenon wasn't magic. It wasn't supernatural. It was aerodynamics, specifically the limitations of the Zero's wing and control surface design. But no one fully understood the mechanism behind it. That's why the Akutan Zero mattered. As the recovery team worked, they prepared the fighter for transport. With ropes, pulleys, and improvised supports, they began lifting the aircraft out of the bog. The sound of straining rope fibers mixed with the groan of metal shifting for the first time in weeks. Mud suctioned beneath the fuselage as it rose. Every movement felt delicate. One misstep could destroy the most valuable intelligence prize the U.S. Navy had encountered since the war began. Hours later, as they secured the Zero to a makeshift sled for dragging across the tundra, the fog thinned just enough for sunlight to skim the faded green paint. For a moment, the aircraft seemed alive again, a ghost of the battles it had fought. By the time the Zero was finally loaded for transport to Dutch Harbor, word had already spread across the command chain. A captured Japanese fighter, intact, a miracle find, a turning point. Soon, it would be shipped to San Diego. Soon, American test pilots would climb inside, feel the controls under their fingertips, and drive the aircraft through the air. Not in combat, but in careful, instrumented tests. And when they did, they would uncover the truth behind the Zero's greatest secret, why it dominated at low speeds, yet struggled at high ones. But on the quiet morning of July 10, 1942, the man on Akutan Island knew only one thing. They had found something extraordinary, something that would shift the balance of understanding in the Pacific. The fog began to lift. The sea breeze carried the smell of salt and kelp, and behind them, sitting low in the earth, the Zero waited to reveal its secrets, secrets that had haunted American pilots since the first days of the war. And somewhere beyond that distant horizon, more clues were already forming. In scattered wrecks on Pacific islands, in field notes written by intelligence officers, in the quiet workrooms of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, where engineers studied every fragment of enemy machinery they could get their hands on. These separate efforts would soon converge, painting a full picture of the Zero's strength and its hidden weaknesses. For now, though, it all began here, on a cold, remote island with a crash fighter and a handful of men who understood its importance. What they didn't know yet, what no one fully grasped, was how dramatically this discovery would change the tactics, the training, and even the morale of pilots fighting across the Pacific. And what they were about to learn in the months to ahead would challenge everything they thought they knew about the Japanese Zero. The hangar doors at Naval Air Station North Island groaned open as mechanics rolled the captured Zero into the light, its green paint still streaked with Alaskan lead. The air smelled of oil, solvents, and heated metal, familiar scents in a place where dozens of American fighters were serviced daily. But on this morning, every eye followed the strange aircraft moving across the floor. Conversations stopped. Wrenches fell quiet. Even veteran pilots who had flown combat missions from Guadalcanal to Midway paused at the sight. For the first time in the war, the United States had the enemy's prize fighter in perfect working condition. Word spread quickly. Engineers, naval officers, pilots of the Marine Corps, and intelligence personnel all gathered around it. Some touched the wings softly, as if afraid it might vanish. Others stared at the cockpit, imagining the enemy who once sat inside. A single question hung in the air. What would this machine reveal? As the Zero settled into the center of the hangar, the testing crew began examining it with a precision that bordered on reverence. The sound of metal tools echoed off the high ceiling. Flashbulbs popped as photographers documented every surface. Engineers traced control cables with fingertips, noting their positions. They measured the dihedral angle of the wings, the thickness of the skin panels, the construction of the spars. Then came the test pilots. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, one of the Navy's most experienced aviators, approached the aircraft slowly, studying it like a predator evaluating another predator. He had fought Zeros in the early months of the war. He had seen friends shot down by them. Now, he would fly one. But before anyone climbed into the cockpit, the engineers needed to understand the aircraft on the ground. Mechanics removed inspection panels. They checked rivet lines, examined the landing gear linkage, evaluated the engine mount supports. Everything they found reinforced one conclusion. The Zero was built to be exceptionally light. Its designers, led by Jiro Horikoshi, had sacrificed nearly everything that added weight: armor, heavy control mechanisms, reinforced fuel tanks, in exchange for agility. This explained the aircraft's legendary maneuverability, but it did not yet explain why its controls stiffened at higher speeds. While the mechanics worked, intelligence officers gathered on the upper walkway overlooking the hangar floor. They read through translated Japanese manuals recovered from prior rates. They compared notes from pilots who had fought the Zero over the Philippines, Java, and the Coral Sea. Again and again, testimonies mentioned the same high-speed weakness. Yet no one had been able to measure it. That would change within days. When the Zero was finally deemed safe to fly, the mechanics stepped back. Sanders climbed the ladder into the cockpit. The hangar felt almost silent. He rested his hands on the stick and throttle, testing their motion. The stick felt incredibly light, almost shockingly so. Moving it required barely any force. The rudder pedals sank under his boots with effortless ease. This was the first sign of the Zero's design philosophy. In low-speed dogfights, the slightest input translated into immediate maneuver. No wonder American pilots felt overwhelmed when trying to engage one in a turning fight. When the ground crew rolled the Zero out onto the runway, the California sun beat down on its wings. Sanders strapped in, tested communication equipment, signaled thumbs up, and advanced the power. The engine roared to life. Dust kicked up behind the tailwheel as the fighter accelerated. Its engine note was distinctive, a rising, sharp mechanical whine, very different from the deeper rumble of American Pratt & Whitney or Wright engines. In a moment, the Zero lifted from the runway, its landing gear folding into place. The Americans watched as the enemy's fighter rose into the sky under their control for the first time. Sanders later wrote that the aircraft was extraordinarily responsive at low speeds. He felt connected to the controls, as if the machine read his thoughts. But the true purpose of these tests lay ahead. As he leveled off at altitude, he eased the throttle forward and began increasing speed. Instruments vibrated slightly. The slipstream intensified. He tested the ailerons. At 160 knots, they remained feather-light. At 180 knots, still responsive. At 200 knots, he felt the first change. He radioed down, ailerons stiffening. This was expected, but the engineers needed specifics. They watched from below, recording every detail of the flight. Sanders continued the test. At 220 knots, the resistance increased sharply, far more than in American fighters. At 240 knots, he had to lean into the stick with effort. At 250 knots, the ailerons felt almost locked in place. Not frozen completely, but close enough that quick rolls or lateral corrections became almost impossible. This was the Zero's hidden weakness. The same phenomenon Japanese pilots had compensated for through brilliant tactics. The same limitation U.S. pilots had sensed during combat. Now, finally, it was measured. Sanders returned to the field and taxied to the hangar. The moment he stepped out, engineers surrounded him.
His flight suit smelled of fuel and wind-borne salt from a nearby ocean. Sweat ran down his forehead. He pulled off his gloves, tossed them on the wing, and began describing the experience. He spoke of the exceptional climb rate, the wide field of view, the almost weightless stick. But most importantly, he described the stiffening controls. Intelligence officers recorded his words with urgency. Aerodynamicists compared the findings with theoretical predictions. Naval tacticians began reviewing the implications. A fighter that was nearly unbeatable below 200 knots became vulnerable above 240 knots. Suddenly, pilot testimonies from the early Pacific battles made sense. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, the Technical Air Intelligence Unit was conducting their own examinations of damaged Zeros recovered from crash sites across the Solomons and New Guinea. Their engineers noted the same structural tendencies: light construction, fabric-covered ailerons, and control linkages prone to aerodynamic stiffening under compression. Slowly, a complete picture began to form. Back in the hangar, the Zero was prepared for another flight, and another. 17 flights were in total conducted, each more detailed than the last. Sanders pushed the aircraft through dives, climbs, acceleration tests, and simulated combat maneuvers. Instrumentation captured control forces, aerodynamic loads, stall characteristics, and roll rates. During one high-speed dive test, he attempted a rapid bank to the right. The aircraft barely responded. He reported afterwards that at those speeds, turning against an American fighter capable of maintaining maneuverability would be nearly impossible for a Zero pilot. This single finding began influencing American tactics immediately. F-44 Wildcat pilots, long frustrated by the Zero's turning ability, were instructed to avoid slow-speed dogfights. Instead, they were told to dive away, gain speed, and re-engage from above, a tactic that exploited the Zero's aerodynamic weakness. Later, this same insight became the foundation of the boom and zoom strategy used by Hellcat and Corsair pilots, all because of the captured aircraft sitting in that hangar. As the tests continued, engineers uncovered other insights. The Zero's wings, which seemed strong enough in normal flight, flexed significantly under high-speed conditions. This flexing contributed to the loss of aileron authority. They also discovered asymmetric compressibility around the wingtips that worsened roll response above certain speeds. Back at the intelligence offices, analysts compared these findings with pilot notes from the front lines. Everything aligned. Even the experiences of AVG, or Flying Tiger pilots, flying P-40s in China, now made more sense. The P-40 could dive faster and retain control, giving it a brief advantage despite being inferior in most low-speed maneuvers. The mystery was solved through science, not speculation. Each revelation strengthened the American understanding of their enemy, and each detail helped close the gap that had cost so many lives in late 1941 and early 1942. But one of the most shocking discoveries was not aerodynamic at all. Engineers found the Zero had a manually operated mixture control system and limited supercharging. This explained why the Zero excelled at low to medium altitudes and struggled above 20,000 feet. American fighters with turbo superchargers now had a clear upper hand at higher altitudes. Inside briefing rooms, where the air smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, and chalk dust, tactics instructors drew diagrams on blackboards. They explained to new pilots how the Zero's impressive agility was countered by weaknesses in dive speed, high-altitude performance, roll rate, and durability. Young aviators nodded, absorbing every detail. For the first time, they had data, not rumors, to guide their survival. What the engineers and pilots learned from the captured Zero soon made its way into field manuals and combat training films. From carriers in the Pacific to training bases in Florida, pilots repeated the new mantra: never turn with a Zero. Dive, use speed, fight smart. The captured aircraft changed minds, changed tactics, and in many cases, changed destinies.
The morning fog clung low over the airfield as engineers rolled the captured Zero out for what would become its most revealing flight. Dew still clung to the grass. A thin layer of mist drifted across the taxiway, swirling around the wheels as the aircraft moved forward. The men who had worked on it for weeks watched in silence. They had studied every rivet, traced every cable, listened to every engine note. But one critical question still lingered in their minds. What would happen if the Zero was pushed to its absolute limit? The earlier tests had revealed astonishing strengths and dangerous weaknesses. But to fully understand the aircraft, they needed to compare it directly with the newest American fighters, side by side in the same sky. Only then would they grasp the full meaning of the control stiffening that had shocked Sanders during the high-speed dives. On this morning, the fighter chosen for comparison was the F-4F Wildcat. Its rugged frame and dependable controls made it the backbone of the Navy's early war efforts. Pilots trusted it. They knew how it behaved in dives, turns, and climbs. And now, that familiarity would serve as the perfect measuring stick. Sanders walked toward the Zero slowly, tightening his gloves. Across the runway, Lieutenant Jimmy Flatley approached the Wildcat assigned to him. Both men exchanged a brief nod. Two veterans preparing for a test that would define the tactics of the Pacific Air War. Ground crews cleared the field. Engines roared. Moments later, the Zero and Wildcat streaked down the runway, nearly side by side, lifting into the air like two rival predators entering the same hunting ground. From the ground, the contrast was striking. The Zero, agile and graceful. The Wildcat, sturdy and relentless. As the two fighters gained altitude, the sun finally pierced the fog, scattering golden light across their wings. Sanders began the maneuver sequence. He eased the throttle and rolled the Zero into a gentle turn, feeling the aircraft respond with that uncanny low-speed agility. The Wildcat followed. At this speed, neither aircraft held a clear advantage. But then came the real test. Climbing to altitude, the pilots prepared for synchronized high-speed dives. Engineers on the ground raised binoculars and clipboards. Intelligence officers stood behind them, ready to record every detail. Sanders tipped the Zero forward first. The nose dropped. Wind rushed across the canopy. The altimeter spun downward. Below him, the ocean glinted like polished metal. At 220 knots, he tested the ailerons. They stiffened, just as before. At 240 knots, they resisted sharply. At 250 knots, they felt nearly solid. His mind replayed the earlier tests, every number, every vibration. He knew what was coming. But the Wildcat, diving beside him, began to separate. Flatley still had full roll control. He could bank left, bank right, correct his dive, and reposition at will. The Zero could not. This was the moment American tacticians had waited for. Proof, visible, undeniable, that speed was the key. As the aircraft pulled out of their dives, the cloud of mystery surrounding the Zero finally lifted. The pilots returned to the airfield, taxied in silence, and climbed down from their cockpits as engineers rushed forward. Sanders removed his helmet and rested it on the wing. He said, "At high speeds, a Zero pilot is trapped. He can't roll away. He can't evade. Once he's fast, he's predictable." It was a simple statement, but it reshaped U.S. naval aviation. Over the next days, engineers and tacticians gathered in briefing rooms to translate the test flights into survival strategies. The air inside those rooms was thick with cigarette smoke, the chalk dust from diagrams on blackboards, and the tension of urgency. Every officer knew that the men flying in the Pacific needed this information not next month, not next week, but now. Training films were written, manuals updated, squadrons briefed. Use a dive to escape. Use attack from above. Do not engage in a turning fight. Use speed. Use altitude. Fight on your terms. These phrases became a new doctrine,
one built entirely around exploiting the Zero's high-speed control stiffening. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, the Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Pacific continued their own tests on other damaged Zeros. Their findings reinforced everything Sanders had discovered at North Island. TAIU engineers reported drastic loss of roll response above specific speeds, documenting changes in control forces measured with instrumentation. They noted wing flexibility, aileron hinge limitations, and aerodynamic compressibility issues. Together, these studies formed the most comprehensive intelligence picture of the Zero ever assembled. But the transformation that followed went deeper than tactics. Across American design studios and manufacturing plants, the data began to influence future aircraft engineering itself. Teams working on the F-66 Hellcat and F-4U Corsair reviewed the captured Zero reports closely. They emphasized stronger structures, better roll control at high speeds, and protection that the Zero lacked. American aircraft grew heavier, stronger, faster, and more forgiving under stress. The Zero remained deadly in the hands of skilled Japanese pilots. Its agility was unmatched in close combat. Its range was extraordinary. But now the Americans understood it fully. The myth of its invincibility was broken. As the months passed, the skies over the Pacific changed. Pilots who once feared the swirling dogfights of early 1942 now fought with new confidence. They knew how to escape. They knew when to strike. And slowly, air superiority shifted. Back at North Island, the captured Zero sat quietly in the hangar between tests, its once feared silhouette now a respected but understood opponent. The men who worked on it developed an odd reverence for the machine. They admired its engineering brilliance, while recognizing its limitations. Many later said they felt they had come to know the aircraft, its strengths, its flaws, even its personality. But a sense of melancholy surrounded it as well. They knew the aircraft had belonged to a young Japanese pilot who crashed on Akutan Island. They knew he had never returned home. And in quiet moments, they realized that every discovery they made, every tactic improved, every insight written into manuals would impact other young pilots on both sides of the war. War was at its core human, not mechanical. And machines, no matter how advanced, always carried the stories of those who flew them. As final tests concluded, the Zero's role shifted from active evaluation to historical reference. Its airframe, now worn from countless flights, remained a symbol of the turning point in understanding the enemy's aviation capabilities. Years later, when war stories were told, veterans spoke not only of battles and victories, but of that strange moment when the United States gained access to its adversary's most feared fighter and discovered how to defeat it. The captured aircraft had revealed a fundamental truth. Every machine has a weakness. The key is understanding it deeply enough to turn knowledge into survival. Today, when historians look back on the Pacific Air War, few single events match the impact of that captured Zero. Its flight tests reshaped tactics. Its engineering taught invaluable lessons. Its limitations guided new designs. Its presence in American hands helped shorten the learning curve that had cost so many lives early in the conflict. And its story continues to echo. Not as a tale of triumph or superiority, but as a lesson in the power of knowledge, the kind that emerges only when one looks directly at the enemy and sees not myth, but reality. The metal skin of that fighter still bore the marks of its crash landing. The cockpit still held the faint scent of oil, and every rivet still whispered the story of the pilot who once trusted it with his life. Understanding the Zero meant understanding the war itself, what courage looked like in the air, what innovation demanded, and how quickly advantage could shift in the chaos of combat. For modern viewers, the message remains powerful. Technological supremacy is never absolute. Innovation is never final. And the difference between defeat and survival often depends on the ability to learn faster than one's opponent. Somewhere in that quiet hangar, on those mornings when sunlight streamed across the wings of an aircraft once feared across the Pacific, America learned precisely that. And the skies were never the same again. If you've ever wondered how one captured aircraft could change the course of a war, or if you have your own thoughts about the Zero's legacy, the story still invites reflection. Sometimes, a single discovery can reshape an entire world.